Let's talk a little bit more about what's ahead for next year, because tech stocks were certainly the star of the show for most of 2023. The so-called Magnificent Seven, fueled by AI enthusiasm, driving the market higher over the course of the year. But possible headwinds could be ahead. There's antitrust lawsuits. We got the ruling yesterday, the latest App Store crackdown against Google, regulators in Europe scrutinizing the industry's concentration of power, and a fear that tech valuations ballooned by AI enthusiasm could come crashing back down. With more on what to expect in tech in 2024, I want to bring in Bob O'Donnell, TECHnalysis Research President and Chief Analyst. Bob, it's great to have you here in studio. So that was a long intro just in terms of some of the biggest headlines that we've seen play out in tech in 2023. Looking ahead to 2024, I think a lot of investors are first focused on that AI enthusiasm. Yep. What do you think that looks like next year?
Well, look, I mean, you could argue that we're overhyped now, and yet real people are just starting to get this stuff in their hands. You think about things like Microsoft's 365, Google's Workspace. Now what's happening is really it's been a tech industry discussion and a little bit of a financial industry discussion, but those tools are starting to get into the hands of people, and really, well, we won't see that till 2024. And I think a lot of people are just going to have their minds blown by this stuff because it really is powerful stuff. So I do think we're going to see continued enthusiasm. I think we're going to see some of the bigger players. I think we're going to see Microsoft. We're going to see Google. We're going to see Meta, who's becoming increasingly important into AI, and some of these other big companies really start to make a stand. Then I think we'll also start to see some of the little companies, Amazon making a bigger purchase in Anthropic. They just did that. We could see more of that, right? Microsoft doing more with OpenAI. There's a lot of those plays that I think we could see next year because there's huge interest in and a recognition that there's only a few companies in the world can really build these enormous models. And you're going to have to be aligned with one of those. Companies will end up using a couple of them. I do think it's going to get a little messy in that regard next year. But fundamentally, you have to have that basis, and then from there you build. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. That's what I'm, from an industry perspective, trying to say, okay, how does this move forward? How do we think about these combinations? And then, again, in the real world, how do companies start to say, okay, I'm going to use Microsoft for this, I'm going to use Amazon for this, I'm going to use Google for this. I think that could be the reality next year.
What type of acceleration, do we see in 2024 or foresee from your perspective with regard to monetization of a lot of this? Because, I mean, it's still, if you think about ChatGPT as the generative AI kitchen table talking point for so many households out there, it's still a larger question of, all right, well, how much would we really feel comfortable paying for it? And then you can scale that all the way up to the organizational side where they've said, this is going to help out with productivity and trying to figure out how much they pay for generative AI.
Yeah, well, and look, Microsoft has said it's $30 a head for Office.
Right.
Google's done the same thing, right? So, and it's going to be those kinds of services. Again, none of that money is kicked in yet at all, right? Right now, you've got a bunch of companies who are beta testing it. That's why I'm saying in 2024, some of the reality of this kicks in because average companies and average people and everybody all of a sudden starts getting access to this. Now, having said that, I have heard a little bit of pushback from some companies like, hey, $30 a head times all my people, that's a lot of money, right? And so there is a little bit of a concern of will there be some pushback? What's that going to do to pricing? The truth of the matter is nobody really knows how to go to market just yet with this because of exactly what you're saying, Brad. I mean, yes, this is really cool stuff, but how do I measure that productivity gain? It's not super clear, and so we're going to see a lot of experimentation on pricing, on go-to-market, on marketing, on packaging of all this stuff as well.
But we also raised some issues there in the intro to your segment, just about antitrust regulation, what that could look like, how big of a headwind that could be for tech next year. Also, valuation, still some concern following the massive runoff that we've seen in a handful of names. What would you view as a top risk for tech heading into the new year?
Well, I mean, I do think the antitrust things are potentially problematic, right? I mean, you can't ignore the fact. I mean, what's crazy is a lot of the things are backwards looking. And for example, there's this discussion of, obviously there was the Google Epic story and what's going to happen there and, who benefits from that? Well, mostly it's game companies, right? It's the gaming companies that may benefit from that. But, there's some discussion about Google's monopoly in search. Well, ironically, when we start to look at generative AI, people are kind of replacing traditional search with generative AI tools. So that's going to dramatically change that perspective. That's why it's so critical for Google to get in there, but it opens up opportunities for other people as well. So, but I do think, to your point, Shauna, that, these kinds of regulatory issues could absolutely come back and bite some of the big companies, because there is a sense, that's driven all this, that these companies have so much influence and control over our lives in ways that we don't even really think about, that perhaps there is a need to kind of put some of this stuff in check. So we'll see what happens, and there's always unintentional consequences sometimes from these moves, and that's really what's going to be interesting to look for in 24.
You've got applications that sit on top of models, models that sit on top of chips. Chips have been the big winner by and large over the course of 2023. What does that signal for 2024 and some of the companies then that could be the biggest winners if there's more of a transition into, okay, now we focus on the actual application that people can have in their hands?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So obviously NVIDIA continues to lead on the training side. AMD had a big event last week where they talked about what they're doing. I think there's a lot of opportunity. Look, people, as much as they love NVIDIA, they want a competitor, right? They really want people. It's like, hey, we can't be completely dominated. AMD is the obvious choice there. The other interesting thing, later this week, I'm here in New York for an Intel event where they're going to talk about some of their new AI chips.
Right.
And what we're going to see is AI running on our PCs and other devices. And that's going to start to change the game. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, let's be clear. But there are some interesting opportunities when we look at an Intel. We look at a Qualcomm who's going to have some big AI. They already announced it. It's not going to ship till 2024. AMD as well. So all of a sudden, and of course, NVIDIA. So you've got all of these kinds of companies. And you've got smaller players who's starting to think about doing things on, they're talking about AI on the edge. What sorts of applications they can leverage intelligence for, other kinds of applications, factory automation, all sorts of other areas. Not as sexy and not as well known and smaller, but in some become interesting. So a lot of interesting players on the chip front to watch, I think, over the next year. Again, I don't think there's going to be somebody that comes out of the blue. This is not a business that somebody can all of a sudden come out of the blue. You kind of know who it's going to be, right? Yeah. It's just a question of degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And how much money they're deploying towards a lot of these solutions, too. That Intel AI Everywhere event going to be taking place tomorrow, I believe. So we'll see how INTC, ticker symbol, moves around on that day. Bob, thanks so much for taking the time here with us. Guys.